Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
As a business and healthcare law firm, we meet a lot of interesting people and learn their amazing stories. This season, we're entering the fancier season of a business, Brad. We're in the buying and selling season.
Yeah, and those who are hearing this for the very first time, Michael, that's just one of 4 seasons. What are the other ones?
Yeah, we have the building season, starting a business, the operating season, running a business, the scaling season, growing a business, and then where we are now, buying and selling.
Awesome. All right, you're up to bat. What do you got for me today?
Do you remember the movie There's Something About Mary?
First, I'm so proud of you, Michael, for really bringing in at the beginning of the show movie talk. I approve. Second, I've seen that movie so many times in college. I probably could mute it and do most of the movie with and do most of the quotes.
Same. I read an article recently that actually had nothing to do with the movie, but I instantly thought about the movie. It made me remember the scene where Ben Stiller had picked up a hitchhiker.
Yes, and he was carrying a bag that was clearly a dead person.
Yes.
And that had been the whole setup of the movie about how hitchhikers were serial killers.
Yeah, and the car ride started to take a turn when the hitchhiker had shared his business idea. And the whole premise was based on a personal workout video called 8-Minute Abs. And his business plan was to create a video called 7-Minute Abs.
Right. Yeah, it was a great scene as the hitchhiker talks to him about the 6-minute abs and tells him it should be 7-minute abs. And because as the 7 key number here, that'd be, and he starts going through 7-Eleven, 7 Dwarves, 7 Men. He goes on and on about the number 7. What movie or business article did you read that has to do with this?
As I said, it had nothing to do with it, but
Okay.
I guess the number made me think of it. I don't know. But it struck me when I was reading about a country that's trying to do the opposite of trends in workplace culture. I read an article that Greece recently made a bold move by introducing a 6-day work week for certain businesses.
Yeah, I read that too, and I'm sure all our employees are hoping that we don't get any new ideas.
Yeah. I mean,
well, hold on. Kennedy's nodding. I can see.
Oh.
We have 1 vote so far, not 6-day. Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, the rules are in place to try to boost the Greek economy. It extends the typical 40-hour work week to 48 hours for private businesses that provide around-the-clock services.
All right. Well, how are the Greek workers responding?
It's not as big a change as you would think. This actually surprised me. Of course, the labor unions are up in arms, but the Greek workers already log more hours than basically any other country, all the other EU nations, and more than kind of the traditionally recognized overworked Japan and United States.
Yeah. Okay, really. Yeah, that's a crazy shift. Do you think it has do you think it's something that we'll ever see happen here in the States?
According to the article, almost 1/3 of U.S. businesses are considering cutting their work week down from the traditional 40-hour week. So I think there's a lot of momentum going the opposite direction. I don't see it reversing.
Yeah, and I'm sitting here thinking about all those professionals in the M&A world who like basically work 8 days a week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they might like this. It might give them like a vacation.
Yeah, it'd be like their version of a 4-day work week.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say this because I actually also read an article last week about the big Wall Street banks, and they're trying to manage the kind of burnout factor of their, their 8-day work week basically, and implement rules to manage their schedules. And I didn't realize this. Many of the banks already have a safe period. I'm putting this in quotes where an employee cannot be forced to work. And it struck me that like one of the safe periods that's recognized is basically from Friday evening to Saturday morning.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's the safe time.
Yes.
They may end up moving to Greece before it's all over, though.
True. Yeah. Well, I'm also just making a note that if we ever open a Greece office, that I don't want to work there.
Yeah, I don't think anyone on our team would want to be there in that position. What does this have to do with today's show, Michael?
Do you want me to stretch it or admit that this does not have a strong connection to today's show?
Well, what I'm really sad about, Michael, is I really thought we would have movie talk at the beginning. We'd bring movie talk into this show. So let's just get in the story since you're such a disappointment.
Well, I may have a little nugget for you.
Okay.
So our main character today is Dr. Wolf. He is a financially savvy plastic surgeon from the Midwest.
All right. I'll bite. Why Dr. Wolf?
Because before he became a plastic surgeon, he actually worked on Wall Street. This guy knows his way around numbers.
All right. Well, I'm also assuming that you're taking this name from the movie The Wolf of Wall Street.
Yes.
Also, this is actually very unusual, as most physicians do not have any formal business education or training prior to actually starting their medical practice.
You're right. And Brad, you noted I had another movie reference in there, so you should be happy.
It's a nod.
So Dr. Wolf is financially sophisticated for sure, but there is a bit of a downside. His personal touch with his employees was not exactly the greatest.
Yeah, sounds like someone who is maybe advocating for the 6, 7, or 8 day work week.
Yeah, you could be right. So, anyway, back to the story. Anyway, Dr. Wolf's practice we're going to call EBITDA plastic surgery.
Oh, wow. I think we do have our first vocabulary word of the day. Please define EBITDA.
So, this is a big finance term. It means earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And it's used as a measure of a company's overall financial health and performance. And in the M&A world, as we've talked about on prior episodes, this is the marker that helps determine kind of the purchase price or the valuation that private equity will use oftentimes. So you'll hear terms like, they sold for 6 times EBITDA or some other multiple.
Gotcha. Now that makes more sense. Thanks for explaining that to the audience.
So Dr. Wolf was so focused on the financial performance of his practice that we feel like we can only capture it by naming it after his favorite word.
Got it. Yep. So what kind of services was Dr. Wolf's practice offering?
The practice focused on body procedures. They did a lot of liposuction. That was their biggest moneymaker.
Okay.
They did some tummy tucks. They did some breast work, but no facial plastic surgery. And they had kind of a, quote, non-invasive side. They had a separate laser center for non-invasive treatments. And then they started to expand it into some traditional medical spa offerings like injectables.
Yes. And I remember correctly, we were discussing off camera, Dr. Wolf's laser center had grown quite a bit, right?
Yes. Yeah. They scaled to 2 locations. They opened a laser center in Texas, and then they opened a second laser center in Florida.
Yeah. And last season, we were concentrating on scaling. And so expanding different states really does have its own set of challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the main hurdles for Dr. Wolf was staffing. Both the Texas and Florida locations had similar setups with multiple nurse practitioners, physician assistants, and registered nurses to handle these, injectables and laser services. And so kind of keeping them appropriately staffed and finding and retaining talent was one of his challenges he faced when he was scaling these up.
Yeah, and we talked about this the last season, but there are challenges. Scaling a medical practice is different, especially in different states involved. Because you have to obviously navigate the complex landscape from a regulatory perspective, insurance, staffing, technology, logistics. All those can really add some complications to it. And a successful practice really will have to do some significant planning, actually invest in time, again, on our compliance and operational capabilities to really ensure that obviously they need effective patient care, but also business is sustainable.
Right. Although the staffing in terms of kind of the people were similar and their licenses, there were differences in the 2 locations.
Okay. I'm assuming when you say differences, maybe not the same services?
Yeah, the mix was different. Texas was heavy and really reliant on the laser services, and Florida was kind of the opposite. It was really heavy on injectables.
All right. You're talking about heavy, so how heavy on the injectable services?
They accounted for 75% of the revenue in the Florida location. And it really came down to three kind of rock star injectors. They were high performers. And from a, everyday perspective, Dr. Wolf loved that.
Yeah, well, that's a really high proportion of your practice then.
Yeah. And did I mention their names? I can't.
No, you did not.
Okay. Yeah. We have Nurse Kardashian,
Hmm.
Miss Jenner, and Nurse Hilton.
Yeah, I know we've used Miss Kardashian as a character name in other podcasts before. I'm guessing these other individuals maybe have a very large presence on MySpace or those other socials out there.
Yeah, I don't know that they're big into MySpace, Brad. I know
Okay,
that's your big channel, but yes, they were social. They had big followings on social media.
gotcha.
These injectors, as I said, they were the bread and butter of the Florida clinic.
So what happened next? I'm assuming because we're in the buying selling season that Dr. Wolf decided to sell.
Way to use your context clues,
You're
Brad. We're
welcome.
in the buying and selling season.
Yes.
He's named Dr. Wolf,
Mhm.
EBITDA Plastic Surgery. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So,
Do I get a
yes.
star for that?
Um, Kennedy, please give Brad a half of a star
Oh.
because he only mentioned the season. He didn't mention the names as his context clues.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'll reserve the other half for you
Okay.
later, maybe. Dr. Wolf decided it was time to go to market. He brought in an old finance buddy, and we're going to call him Mr. Swagger to help him with the sale.
I was hoping when you started swag, I was hoping like Schwarzenegger, but Swagger, okay. Why the name?
Can you please give me back that half star? And so Mr. Swagger had zero experience selling medical practice, Brad.
Okay.
But what he lacked in experience, he made up for in confidence. He acted like he was in charge the entire time.
I think Schwarzenegger would still work here. I'm sorry, but I'm going to rule against Swagger. But okay. If we're in a red flag season, I think while you were talking, I definitely would have dinged you first for taking away my star, but second, that's pretty bad. So what did they do?
So Mr. Swagger, to be fair, was really smart with numbers, just like his old buddy, Dr. Wolf. They did make a few mistakes. They didn't hire counsel at first, so they just kind of were focused solely on the business, focused on the numbers. But he did a pretty good job as it relates to the numbers. Mr. Swagger did a quality of earnings analysis before going to market to help kind of establish their position.
Oh, wow. I think we have another vocabulary word. It's a word that our private equity friends like so much. I think they have tattooed Q of E on their biceps.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
Yeah, so it often, well, basically what it is it's an audit to make sure kind of the reported earnings of a company are accurate and sustainable. They're really taking a deep dive into the financials and trying to clean it up for any one-time events or unusual events. And we've talked about this in other episodes. Oftentimes, when someone's selling, they'll preemptively get their own Q of E done because buyers are always going to do a Q of E as part of the due diligence process, and it really helps the buyers when they do this understand the true profitability of the business.
Yeah, I always think of it as they're pressure testing their actual numbers to make sure that there is something. So it makes sense they did that. So how did the sale go?
Well, they found a buyer, Brad, and
Ooh.
Dr. Wolf signed an LOI, and you're gonna. I'm. This is not a mistake. He signed it for a valuation of 9 times EBITDA, which is a really big number, and I'm sure that Mr. Swagger had a little extra pep in his step when they got that signed
I'm
LOI.
sure he did. That's an interesting number. And I'll say this for those hearing it, why Michael's, I guess, voice raised when he said 9 times. The sale of medical practice, typically, they generate buyers. There's a lot of factors that go into this. Obviously, we were talking about pressure testing their financials. And we were discussing, selling multiple locations. That's also a factor. But in this case, what we normally see is somewhere between 5 to 10 times EBITDA. And the reality, the range is obviously reflective of the market dynamics. What are they paying for at the time, and then clearly the financial and operational health of that practice. And so obviously that compression they did with the QOV actually helped a lot.
Yeah, for sure. It was on the high end of what you see typically in deals, which is, reflective of a healthy financial picture. So what's interesting, Brad, is that, as I said, they didn't have counsel involved early on. And so we were hired after the LOI was signed. And believe it or not, things started to unravel before we even started.
Uh-oh. What happened?
Dr. Wolf told his team about the sale at about the same time he hired us, unbeknownst to us, announced it. And the entire staff at the Florida location quit.
All of them. Okay. And they just did, we're on the LOI phase, and there's so many steps that happen in a typical deal that seems way, way too early.
Yeah, I mean, we had a signed LOI and they hadn't even had a kickoff call yet. The ink wasn't even dry on hiring us. And so, yeah, Nurse Kardashian, Miss Jenner, and Nurse Hilton all left together to join a local plastic surgeon. And their premises, they wanted nothing to do with private equity. They were afraid of how it was going to affect, their practice. And because they were such, kind of powerful figures in that location, the rest of the employees ended up following them.
Ouch. Yeah, that had to be a huge shock to Dr. Wolf and Mr. Swagger.
Yeah, and probably not surprising, 2 weeks later, the deal collapsed.
Michael, we've got a bleeder.
Oh, way to bring something about Mary back in.
You're welcome.
All right, give that star back to Brad. I think this is a great spot to pause for a quick commercial break. When we return, we can dive into the legal implications of what went wrong.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd. Now, Michael, for those not listening, this season our theme is buying and selling a business. And we're talking about stories and client problems that happen in the buying and selling season. And today we've been talking about Dr. Wolf, a financial savvy plastic surgeon who scaled his business across multiple states, only for things to kind of fall apart. And I'm not sure if it helped that Mr. Swagger was involved or not involved, but the moment he announced that he was selling his practice.
That's right, Brad. Dr. Wolf's story is a prime example of why timing, team culture, and communication are so crucial when you're entering into a sale transaction.
Yeah, and just for a recap, Michael, maybe can give some of the key components of the story for our listeners, because I know we're going to go deeper dive with the analysis.
Yeah, so let's reset. Dr. Wolf is a plastic surgeon. He had scaled his plastic surgery practice, really focusing on the non-invasive side by opening laser centers in multiple states. He had opened in Texas and Florida, that in addition to his surgical and combined laser center in the Midwest. His Florida clinic was particularly dependent on 3 top injectors: Nurse Kardashian, Miss Jenner, and Nurse Hilton, and they generated 75% of the revenue of that practice. Dr. Wolf, as we discussed, felt that the market timing was right and decided to sell the business, and he brought in his finance buddy, Mr. Swagger, to help facilitate the sale. As it relates to kind of the blocking and tackling on the financial side, they really did a great job of going to market and creating demand and ultimately signing a letter of intent for 9 times EBITDA, which is, as we discussed, a really large multiple. Problem arose when Dr. Wolf told his team about the sale. The staff at the Florida clinic, all of them, including these top injectors, quit, and the entire deal fell apart 2 weeks later.
Yeah, and audience members, when we hear these stories, I actually remember this pretty well. I remember us getting it going because that we had the LOI rolling
Yeah.
and we are going to get the call going. And the next thing I know, I was talking with one of our colleagues about it. And they're like, yeah, the deal died. I'm like, that's the fastest I've ever seen a deal die ever. And obviously, it's a significant turn of events that happened here, underscoring how critical is in each phase. And we've talked about phases and other ones, but it's critical to our listeners is the importance of understanding your team and culture, especially when entering to a sales transaction. So, Michael, let's dive deeper into that. Why is a team so critical to a deal?
Yeah, Brad. I mean, the team is the lifeblood of any business, and especially in the service industries like healthcare. I mean, they are the ones creating the revenue, and
Hmm.
so buyers are not buying the name or a building. They're buying the production, the expertise, the relationships, and of course the operations of that location that the team delivers. And so continuity of staff is a huge factor in the buyer's decision to move forward with the transaction. If key personnel leave, especially high revenue generators like the ones in our story, the value of the deal can evaporate overnight or just make the whole deal go away.
Yeah, and that's right. And I think many sellers underestimate how much trust they have to have built, not just
Right.
between the buyer and the seller, but between the seller and their actual team. And employees, they need to feel secure about their future, and if they're going to be, if they're going to stick around post closing, that's going to help kind of get them there. So, what are your thoughts on why the team culture is also important to the buyer?
Well, we've talked about this also in other episodes. So let's take a step back. I mean, we know that private equity, number one on the list, probably still is the financials. I mean, you do the Q of E, they want to make sure what the numbers say are true. But really shortly behind that are two big factors that make or break deals: compliance and the team.
Hmm.
And buyers want to know, as it relates to the team, that when they're acquiring a business, with us, that want to know that they're acquiring a business with a stable, positive culture, because that can impact everything from employee retention to patient satisfaction. And so, a toxic or uncertain culture can lead to high turnover, which is not good for the predictability of future revenues and lower morale. And so, in Dr. Wolf's case, there may have been an underlying issue with team morale that went unnoticed until the sale was announced. A strong, engaged team creates a smoother transition. There's that trust built up that you just referenced,
Yep.
and that's what buyers are looking for. They want the practice to keep performing at the same level at a minimum, and they're actually expecting and projecting it to be better after the
Yeah,
transaction.
totally agree. Yeah, the on that piece, it's a huge issue, and it leads to another important topic that every employee loves us to talk about, and every employer loves us to talk about: non-competes. Now, Michael, do you know if Dr. Wolf's Florida location had non-competes in place?
Well, unfortunately, Brad, the answer is no. There were no non competes for the injectors at the Florida location, which meant they were free to leave and take their talents and their patients elsewhere.
That statement reminds me of LeBron James quote when he was leaving Cleveland the first time. I'm going to take my talents to South Beach. So I guess they maybe did the same thing. It's a tough lesson to learn. I mean, non-competes can be critical tool in transitions like this and transactions like this. If Dr. Wolf had non-compete in place, his injectors would not have had the ability just to walk away and freely join a competitor down the street, down the block, or as easily.
Yeah, exactly. Non competes are designed to protect the buyer and the seller by preventing these key employees from jumping ship and then, of course, taking the business with them. In M&A transactions, non-competes can also help kind of retain value in the business post-sale because it ensures the buyer isn't left kind of holding the bag or taking on the risk that the employees will leave. They have some level of legal protection.
Yeah, and you know, as of this date, while we're recording, there's probably going to be some questions. Well, I heard the FTC get rid of it. There is no more non-competes. That's not actually exactly correct. So, for those not familiar, the Federal Trade Commission, its job is to enforce federal competition and consumer protection laws to protect or to prevent anti-competitive, deceptive, and unfair business practices. So, taking a step back, in January of 2023, they published this rule that basically says that non-competes are anti-competitive, basically. And then in May of 2024, they published in the Federal Register the rules. And as of September of 2024, the final rule banning most non-competes, I won't go through all the details, was scheduled, I use that word purposely, to go into effect. However, as you can imagine, lots of lawsuits were filed.
Within 3 hours, I
Yes,
think.
saying the FTC really lacked authority to be able to do this, and that these types of laws, or excuse me, these types of arrangements, non-competes, is contractual and therefore should be with the states. So there's a case called Ryan LLC versus the Federal Trade Commission. And in that particular case, a federal court has agreed with the plaintiff, Ryan LLC, saying the FTC had exceeded its statutory authority and that the FTC's rule was arbitrary and capricious and otherwise not in accordance with their ability as an agency to do certain things. And therefore, the law is unenforceable and unconstitutional. So, as of this moment, it's obviously going up the chain of appeals. The non-compete law that was supposed to go into effect nationally in September is at this moment not in effect.
Yeah, so it's back to what it's always been, which is state law, and we should note as a kind of a plug into the story that Florida does allow non-competes, and so this was really more a matter of bad planning by Mr. Swagger in advising and Dr. Wolf and kind of how he was setting up to protect his practice.
Yeah.
But another critical factor that we've touched on is timing, specifically the timing of when do you tell the team about a sale. So Brad, when is the right time to let your employees know?
Number one, not the day you sign the LOI.
I think we all agree with that. Yeah.
Number two, not after the day you close. Those are probably the two bad ones. But
Yes.
but it's a tough one, and in seriousness about, and when we were in these panel talks with people, there is no one size that fits all. And generally speaking, earlier the information to these certain key employees, the better. So if you have certain people who will be helping you with this transition, you want to bring them in earlier. And especially if they're part of the idea that you're going to succeed post-closing. So if the business to succeed, you need these certain key employees. And hopefully, as you were elaborating earlier, if you're building up trust and you're transparent with these employees, that will help kind of minimize the risk or alarming your staff and how they react. And if you go if you're too early, then obviously that's not unnecessary. And in case this for Dr. Wolf, he was way too early with it, and unfortunately experienced what happens when your staff jumps. And I know that when we have conversations and have panel talks, some people are like, at least 6 weeks or 8 weeks before closing is when you start having those kind of conversations with your team. I know of people who've done it much earlier, but again, it has to do with that transparency and the trust that you've built up your team.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, we've had some clients who, have had a team in place with a lot of trust, and they actually know when they make the decision to go to market, and everybody's kind of on board early on. But that's, you want to be careful that the trust has to be there. And I do that 6 to 8 weeks does resonate as kind of a sweet spot, but it to your point, it has to be kind of dialed in based on the relationships and the circumstances of a particular practice. It's a delicate balance. Brad, final thoughts.
Yeah, when planning to sell a medical practice, obviously it's important to handle communications with your employees thoroughly, and in this case, strategically. Generally giving employees notice about pending sale should occur at appropriate time, as we talked about, with real, careful consideration of these various factors. Only the seller, right, will really know what is best from a timing perspective. Once you do give notice, be prepared to clearly articulate the challenges that you will see. So, why you're selling, why is the sale important for the practice, and what impact it will have on the employees. Anticipate that they're going to ask you changes to management, operations, their salaries, other things of that sort. What happens to their contracts, what happens to their benefits, retirement plans, all these things that may be affected by the sale. And handling these aspects can help lead to at least a smoother transition, and maybe mitigate disruptions, and obviously, hopefully, more importantly, as you said earlier, maintain the culture, the morale of the staff during this entire process. What about you, Michael? Final thoughts?
Yeah, we have to acknowledge financial returns in an M&A deal are important.
Yep.
In fact, they're the most important consideration.
Yes.
But there are other critical issues to safely navigate a sale. And we talked about this earlier, their compliance and team. And we saw today what happens when you do not have a strategy developed to keep your team in place.
Well, Michael, guess what? That's it for this week. We'll be back next Wednesday. We'll discuss another M&A show discussing understanding who holds the cards in negotiations. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.